Welcome to another 21-minute live event. Joining me today is Pete Lyons, Flow and Einstein Analytics Guru, bending the matrix of what's possible with declarative configuration as we continue our quest to Salesforce responsibly. And this time, in 21 minutes, we're here to answer when a business need is identified, how should I know whether or not to use a flow, what are some of the things that we should keep in mind when building flows, and can clicks and code live in harmony? We always talk about clicks, not code, but there's definitely a place for clicks and code. So before we begin, big shout out to anyone that's joining us from the Fort Lauderdale admin community. And Pete, thank you for being with us today.
Happy to be here.
Awesome. Pete, look, there's so much that we can talk about. The little that you and I spoke about everything between analytics and flows and everything. We can do several of these, but today we picked flows. Let's kick it off. When a business need is identified, how do I know whether or not I should use a flow?
Well, I tend to always err on the side of flows because I'm familiar with them, but I typically have a checklist of things that we go down. Item number one, do you need it to fire in a delete context? Then absolutely not a flow. And again, there are some hacky workarounds that we can do with roll-up summaries, but generally best practice, if you need it to fire when something deletes, you're gonna need code. Another one would be if it needs to call out to an external system. If there's an integration involved, you're going to want it to be code. If there's already a lot of code on that object, you're going to want it to be code. Because it's one thing if you're developing your automation strategy from the ground up, you can leverage the invocable framework, but if there's already a ton of Apex in place on that business process or on that object, there's a good chance that if you don't have a very, very thorough understanding of everything that's going to happen, things are going to pinball off of each other, and the automation is just not going to play nicely together. And another scenario would be there's 50 million validation rules on the object. Flows don't always play well with validation rules. There's ways to get around it, but it's going to be an extra lift. Other things that I look at are the sustainability of it. Who's going to have to maintain this? So let's say they have some serious developer chops in-house, but they're kind of light in the admin developer area, then maybe you need to lean toward code just because that's where your skills lie. If they don't have a developer at all, and you're not involved in like some sort of managed services arrangement, then I would avoid code like the plague. Because when that business logic changes, like, hey, maybe next year we add one more extra rule, how are they going to sustain it? And as a consultant, we charge by the hour, but it's not my job to milk my clients. It's my job to deliver success for my clients and to think about that future state. So if I think that they're going to have to maintain this down the line, I prefer to lean on the declarative side. Otherwise, it's just hard to scale.
Yeah, I think you bring up a couple of very good points, and I have definitely come across a couple of orgs, especially clients that have been using Salesforce since like 2010, 11, maybe up to 13, that there's a lot of times that they've built things in code because a lot of functionality wasn't there, and a lot of times it becomes difficult to throw flows on top of it because there's, again, so many things that are happening at the same time. It's almost like you can't take a step forward with declarative without having to untangle a million wires from all the things that were in the past. I mean, I remember even as far back as maybe 2 years ago, I was running into S controls in some orgs.
There's something I haven't heard in a long time.
Exactly. For the people that have been in Salesforce since like 2013 or newer, there was something called S controls. You should look it up. But it's a really good conversation there because there's also, the component that you brought up as a consultant is really important because it's something that we have to keep in mind, right? It's a lot of times you want to make sure that's something that's easy to maintain for a customer. But talking about that, if you're an admin and let's say we have a couple of admins listening in, how do we manage how do we manage like things that we should keep in mind when we want to build a flow? Because a flow is a powerful tool, right? So you can get yourself in trouble even if there's no code. What are some of the things that you'd recommend from that end?
Yeah, definitely. Before I do answer that, one important thing about knowing when to flow or code, always stay up on your release notes, because a lot of times it used to be things like, oh, well, we need a pop-up modal, but now you can do that with a quick action. You can make a button on the account page that's going to call the flow as a pop-up modal. But so when it comes to doing it right, there's a historical stigma where, you know, traditional devs, they tend to look down on flows and process builders like, oh, admin's going wild, broke the org, and now I have to clean up their mess. And that's not because of the people or the tool. It's because code is difficult to learn. And when you have to invest years into learning something, along that way, you're going to learn best practices. And, you know, whereas with flows and process builders, without any trailheads and without any training, you can jump in and you can figure it out for yourself, and you can grind your org to a halt. I went into a client org once, and I don't even know why they needed this, but they had two different process builders. One is going to check the box and wait 12 hours. The other one's going to uncheck the box and wait 12 hours. So as soon as they get to 10,000 records in that object, all time-dependent workflow is going to grind to a halt because they're going to be exceeding the queue. This is terrible design. And then the flow that these process builders were calling, there was the start node, there was a query, and then it was cut off. And all the other logic that it was connected to, which I didn't even bother digging into, was completely disconnected. So I can understand why a developer walking into that scenario is going to think, oh, admin's gone wild, broke the org with flows. But no, it's really, you gotta read, you gotta study. There's a ton of sites out there, Automation Champion, GenWE, unofficialsf.com, Brian Kwong, million great resources out there that can teach you those best practices and help you get off the ground quickly. So a couple of tips. One, if you can absolutely avoid it, never create more than one process builder on an object. You don't know what order they're going to fire in. They could pinball off of each other. You could get stuck in infinite loops. Best practice number two, if the logic on that process builder is too complicated and it becomes difficult to maintain, consider migrating it into a flow. Next, be modular in your flow designs. If there's a piece of repetitive logic, like one example was I built out a system that allowed recruiters to craft a compensation package. And it was a multi-step process, and there were all sorts of different ways that they could do it. But basically, any time that they made a change, we had to look at all the records again and ask, does this require secondary financial approval? That flow was about 350 nodes. And the logic to check for secondary financial approval is about 20 nodes. And it happens in 14 different places. So now, with these constantly shifting requirements and a constantly changing definition of what requires secondary financial approval, am I going to keep messing and changing those 20 different nodes in 14 different places? Absolutely not. I'm going to leverage subflows, because this way my logic is compartmentalized. And not only that, but it helps the trail, create that trail of breadcrumbs. Like when you build, always assume that you will never be the last pair of hands that has to touch it. Because if your business isn't growing, it's dying. And if your business isn't changing, it's dead. So assume that whatever you build, maybe it's a year, maybe it's 2 years, maybe it's 5 years, someone's going to have to come and improve it. Maybe new features came in that allow it to be more efficient. Maybe business processes changed. Maybe business processes were streamlined. You're not going to be the last person to touch that flow. So build it in a way that it is readable, that it is scalable, that is consumable. I don't care if you want to use Hungarian or camel case or whatever your notation is, but stick to it. Don't have one node that's called get case in camel case and one node that's called like query var underscore get my record today, you know, and be professional. Never have nodes that say, please, please, please work, or do the thing, or make rocket go. I'm guilty of that. And do as I say, not as I do. Use that description field. I never do, but use that description field, because again, we can't comment our code. You have to give people a trail of breadcrumbs so that they can follow your work. And that's the closest thing you have to comments. And then just learn about query limits. Understand what DML in a loop is so that you know, like, hey, I'm going to loop over all of these opportunities under the account. And for each one, I need to do a thing. Well, don't do that thing in the loop. Get all the records ready to go. And then when you exit the loop, update them all at once. Then you're only using one DML operation instead of 1 times the number of records.
So really quick then, because actually someone just asked, and it's a perfect question here to ask. we talk about having only one process builder per object, and there's a ton that I can talk to you about that because I entirely agree. And I also learned to respect the description field once I started building flows. It's changed my life once I learned that one. But when you're talking about auto launch flows, should you also try to consolidate everything under one auto launch flow, or should you consider multiple ones?
So there's kind of this idea of like, trigger factories and how you manage classes and stuff like that. If you have 15 different processes that are all governed by flows on a single object and they all need to happen on save, the way I would architect that out is kind of like, a header flow that says, do we need to process automation one? If so, go to a subflow, process automation one, then come back out, go to automation two, do we need to process it? The advantage to this is not only is it digestible, and if process number one needs to get changed, you don't have to tear your whole flow apart. You're just dealing with process one. But the other nice thing about this is you have explicit control over the order in which things are happening. And that's something that developers have had for years, but without knowing best practice, it's just a matter of how to translate this. It's almost like you have to think like a dev without being able to type like a dev.
Right. I think that's a good point there. And I love subflows. It's come in handy a lot of times where when I'm building something, like one of the first questions that come to my mind when I'm building a flow is that could I potentially envision that I need to use this somewhere else later in the future? And if I can, I will always go to subflow. Like I'll build that flow and keep it ready for a subflow. Like I have an input and an output variable and say, you know what, now anytime I need this, just slap that subflow in and call it a day. Because there's also a ton of other benefits, right? Because you can necessarily make changes to a subflow or the flow that's calling it, and without having to reorganize and restructure everything before you save or you activate it.
Yeah, and then another trick that I do, and this is kind of a personal style thing, but everybody that I've ever trained on flows, I teach them this trick. Let's say I have a decision element, and if the criteria is true, I want you to do the thing. If the criteria is not true, just stop. We're done here. What I will typically do is I will create an assignment node called do nothing. And I'll have it take a text variable named nothing, and I'll have it set it to the value nothing. And the reason why is because then there's an output path that gives a visual indication of, okay, we're done here. Because again, I have to build with the assumption that sooner or later, somebody is going to come and have to modify my work and that I'm not the only one that's ever going to touch it. So when they're coming in and they're trying to figure out what is this 300 node nightmare that Pete built that should have been broken into subflows that doesn't have any descriptions populated, at least they can go to that decision element and say, okay, so if the criteria are met, we're going to do a thing. If the criteria are not met, is this what's causing my bug? There's nothing there. Maybe that's the problem. No, that's by design. So I leave that as a visual indicator so that people can understand, like, oh, he's explicitly saying, in this set of circumstances, we do not want the automation to fire.
Yeah, that's a great tip. I've done a couple of close to similar things, particularly on screen flows, just to save myself a couple of seconds when troubleshooting, especially on the debug, that I'll throw a screen node with display text and a fault message and just use a fault variable. So that way, if anything goes wrong on a get, an update or a create, whatever the case may be, if there's a fault, take me there, because a lot of people don't seem to realize, at least when they're learning flows, that when you're exiting a get node, a create, an update node, or even a delete, like there's a second route that you can take for fault, right? You make the first connection, but you can make a second connection for fault, and that has really saved a lot of my time of having to chase down emails and trying to read on an email what went right or what went wrong, and especially when you're testing already in live, and that's usually a little trick that's helped me out a bunch as well.
Yeah, and if you show that message to the end user, you can actually use substring because it's going to be unhandled exception, blah, 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 the actual validation rule error, and then some more blah, 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 like a link. But you can strip out with substring logic just the error message. So if you always have that fault path after create, update, or delete or whatever, you can pop that error message to the end user so they at least know what went wrong in a readable fashion. And the downside of it is the admin's still going to get an error email because the flow most definitely failed. But at least it's a better end user experience than just seeing unhandled exception with no error in it.
Yeah, definitely. And it's a side note here. It's definitely a reason why Salesforce admins drink, because that email going to the end user has caused me more headaches than I care to mention, because I wish there was a way to just route that email to me in many cases, because the amount of crap that I have to explain because they think the matrix broke every time they get the email when something happens while they're testing, or if something, God forbid, if something goes wrong in production. It's just been a nightmare for me sometimes, and it's just half an hour to explain. No, this is just something. We'll take a look into it. It's not that bad. Like they think Morpheus and Neo are about to come and hunt them down, or something. At least I don't know.
And a lot of times it's something as simple as, oh, we forgot to make that pick list required.
Right, exactly. So those are some good
validation rules are the worst.
Yeah, I could definitely share a lot of stories. I think you and I were having this conversation before this, was when I had a client that they got insanely pissed off at how many hours, because we were going over, it was a managed services, and we were going over their hours, but considerably. And we had to sit down and go item by item on the time clock entries. And it turned out to be that 30% of the time was just us going after the Salesforce admin, who was just creating validation rules and process builders just as she needed, and we were having to go in and clean up the errors afterwards. So there's definitely always been a battle in our company between who's on team process builder and who's not. And I've been vehemently against. I think I even posted an idea in Salesforce one day to say that people should be able to get a certification on process builders before Salesforce unlocks the process builder functionality or something. Like there needs to be something or Apex test for process builders.
Yeah, and I mean, by the same token, it's like, a lot of people say that you should have to have your admin cert before you're allowed to access setup. But, I'm on the fence with that one. I am of the mindset that, leave the gate open, and it's up to a business to determine if they're, and vet their resources to see if they're qualified for the job. Don't give out the system admin term to just anybody. Make sure that you do a skill check. Oh, well, they want to see all the data. Okay, well, that's what permission sets are for. We don't need to make them admin. Stay away from modifiable data, but vet out your candidates. And to that point, the problem with flows and process builders running out of control is always a training issue. It's always a training issue. And anybody can do it right if you take the time to teach them best practice.
Right. And that's part of why we're here, right? It's about Salesforcing responsibly. So with a couple minutes we've got left, let's kind of finish off with the last one. Can clicks and code live in harmony? Well, I know you have a lot to share about that.
Yeah, and my abundantly absolute answer is yes, yes, yes. So Salesforce, by virtue of their success, is going to end up creating a labor shortage. And they're trying to get ahead of that curve in several ways. One, they're opening up to the product to people who don't know how to write code and don't have the time, frankly, to learn. And I mean, I'm certified PD1. I can kind of read this stuff, but in my entire 5.5 years in the ecosystem, I've written maybe 100 lines of Apex that ended up in client orders, maybe, and that'd be pushing it. And most of it was copy paste. So, and it's because it's not necessary, because I have these extremely powerful tools at my disposal. So why would I invest time into learning something that I don't actually need to get over that finish line? So by opening up all these tools to admins, they help to solve that labor shortage before it happens, similar to how the evolution of Lightning Web Components and all of the different coding languages that they now support, and it's less that they have to build. Hey, there's this JavaScript function that we don't have in Apex. Let's go build that function. No, let's just open it up to these other languages. And so we can open up that job market where everybody can come in. But let's compare 2013, 2014 Salesforce to current day. Back then, you had to decide right from the beginning, are you going to govern this object with clicks or codes, this process? You need to make some modifications. You end up with a visual force override. Now you need to do something as simple as move a field to the other side of the page, call the dev. you know, and visual force isn't that hard, but we drew a very straight line between in the roles and responsibilities matrix between clicks and code. And it was very, you know, partisan. But now we have the Lightning App Builder, so we can create these beautiful UIs. And if it doesn't quite get us what we need, well, there's the dev. Now, let's say that I have a screen flow that walks a user through the different things that they can buy, and it's on a web page. And oh, do you want this? Do you want this? Click a couple buttons. Now we need to put in your credit card and send that to a payment gateway. Okay, so embed a Lightning Web Component. The dev builds that. Now we decide that, oh, there's a typo on one of those screens. Send in the admin. And clicks and code can live in harmony. So you can enforce your business logic at a flow level. You can have your custom components at an apex level. Through invocable actions in the invocable framework, everything ties together. You see it in next best action. Now we've got support for platform events on flows. So like we can even get around mixed DML. I think, I haven't fully vetted this out yet, but I believe that we can get around mixed DML by having flows and process builders that can generate platform events and subscribe to them. And this can all play together. So you let the devs do what the devs are good at and write some really slick code. Meanwhile, we can do what we're good at and build the flow that decides how this is all orchestrated together. And we live in this modular context where, you know, we can divvy up the work so much better because developers are pretty hard to come by sometimes. And it's a highly competitive market. So if we can free them up and not have them dealing with things like page layouts because it's a visual force override, and we can free them up to deal with the real problems like integration and triggers that need to fire on delete, then we can spread that work around and we can all get the job done together in a more efficient way.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic way to put it. So listen, with that, I mean, I really appreciate you coming along. I really think there were some valuable insights here. I completely agree with everything that you said. It's funny that, you know, being in the ecosystem myself for so long, there's a lot to learn, and I agree with you with the whole where we are today as a life cycle. But clicks and code can definitely live in harmony. I agree with you there. So listen, Pete, for everyone watching, actually, Pete's an amazing guy. I highly, highly recommend you check out his stuff on YouTube. He's got amazing projects to share. It's kind of like really exciting, and you know, maybe we'll talk about that in some other video. But Pete, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. I appreciate everyone who's here. And we'll finish off like always, as Uncle Ben used to say, with great power comes great responsibility. So remember to always Salesforce responsibly so you can keep building amazing solutions out there. And we'll see you on the next video.
Thanks, everybody.